In this episode, we talk about IIM Calcutta removing its director in charge in light of sexual harassment allegations. We also talk about Pakistan launching precision strikes over Iran. But first, we talk about concerns that global investors have about India. Hi, I am NIharika Nanda and you are listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Up until recently, China was the main country receiving the attention of global investors. It is this attention that helped it become the second largest economy in the world. However, with geopolitical tensions on the rise, its population shrinking and economic growth slowing down, investors are looking for other alternatives. And although there are a few other competitors, India appears to be a prime candidate. But Indian Express's Udit Misra writes that at the moment, they have three big concerns. In this segment, my colleague Shashank Bhargava speaks to him about what these concerns are and why India is a viable candidate.
Udit, begin by telling us what is the reason that global investors who have over the years invested in China are now looking for substitutes?
So in the past few years, there have been several events that have actually made the investors in the developed countries in particular, and in some of the biggest economies like the US or some of the European economies, become a little wary of China. Now, one big issue was the COVID disruption, and that created a lot of crisis of confidence between the Western economies and China, which used to trade quite dramatically. But even before COVID, many of the listeners would recall that, during the Trump administration of the US government, there was a lot of strife between US and China. And in fact, that led to almost a stalling of trade relations across the world because it disrupted a lot of supply chains. The two biggest economies sort of fighting it out and taking counter action at each other disrupted everything. And the truth of the global economy is that China is a massive player in the global economy. Over the last 4 decades, China has become increasingly integral in the overall supply chain in the global economy. And every big manufacturer company has some kind of a base in China. The COVID disruption was a tipping point in that it made a lot of companies rethink their dependence on China as a base for production or any such activity. So there is a whole list of things that have made CEOs and company heads across different countries rethink their dependence on China.
Right, and it's in this regard that they're looking for alternatives, looking for countries that at least in part do what China has been doing. There is Mexico, there is also Vietnam. But what makes India a viable candidate? Does our population have anything to do with it?
Yeah, so there are certain hygiene factors that all global investors look for, and which are law and order, rule of law, a free market system. Also, a democracy helps immensely in these matters to sort of perpetuate those values. But in India, what is quite uniquely different is also the size of Indian economy, in which case it is not just useful for producing goods, but also for consumption of those goods. So an Apple doesn't necessarily have to look at India as a production base. Apple also looks at India as a huge market where a lot of future business will happen, which is a unique thing. So when you invest in India and when you sort of make a base here, it's both as a production base and also as a market, which matters a lot because of, again, the scale. India is now the most populous country in the world. We have a much younger population. So you can, sort of imagine that consumption rates will spiral from here. Also because India as an economy has been very ambitious about saying that we want to actually grow faster and raise per capita incomes. And targets have been set for the next 20 years that we want to raise it per capita incomes by 5 times. And the most companies, whether they are in manufacturing or services, they all want to be here because they realize there's a great opportunity to sell their products.
And in your latest piece, you mentioned that there are these 3 concerns that global investors have when it comes to India, beginning with how much an average Indian ends up spending and the extent to which this spending will increase going forward. So could you tell us what spending looks like in the country at the moment?
Yeah, so, listeners must understand that when we talk about GDP, around 55 to 60% of India's GDP comes from the spending that you and I make in our individual capacity. And if you were to see this growth, the growth of this biggest engine of India's GDP, then it has been rather anemic. And it has been that way even before the COVID pandemic, and after the COVID pandemic also, it has been that way. Even in the years when GDP has grown faster, other engines of growth have actually contributed to that. But your biggest engine, which is what you and I consume in our personal capacity, that element has always been muted. It's been around 3%, 4%, 5% kind of level, when your GDP needs to grow at 7 or 8% or even 10% possibly. So, your biggest engine is sort of faltering in that sense, and it has been that way for a long time. A lot of people also say that the government did not spend as much during the COVID pandemic, has made people either overspend at that time and, run down their savings, or has made them now wary of the fact that, because their incomes are not high enough or commensurate to the inflation, they are sort of holding back consumption. So the situation is that even though we are huge in numbers, the consumption uptick that one would imagine associate with a country this size is not happening. So when the world looks at us and says, okay, India is the fastest growing major economy and it's growing at 6 or 7%, then the kind of consumption uptick that they associate or expect out after that is not happening. Consumption is growing at almost half or 60% of that. So that's a big matter of concern. Because what's the point of such a big number of people if they're not consuming?
Right, unless incomes rise and unless people spend more, India's economy will not grow as much as we hope. And people's average spending is one factor, but the other factor you mentioned relates to the private sector, about the extent to which private sector companies invest towards fresh productive capacities. And in our previous conversation, we had talked about how right now it is the government that is doing the majority of the investing in India, building roads and bridges and other projects. Could you remind our listeners why that remains a concern and why global investors want private companies to invest more?
So now this is, again, it's a good thing that the government is doing it at a time when the rest of the economy is faltering. That credit goes to the government. And actually governments as an institution alone can do it, to sort of spend when the rest of the economy is struggling. No other entity can do it. Everybody else tends to get stuck by the budget constraint. Governments can borrow and massively invest. But there are limits to how long governments can continue doing that. A thing that listeners would perhaps hear or read again and again is that India has a growing debt, which is to say that with each year when your fiscal deficit is high, it adds to your debt. Overall country's debt keeps rising and it becomes an issue, because then you just like an individual, if there is too much debt, you'll have to pay it back in future generations, will have to pay more taxes and stuff. So the problem with India's investment demand story is that although on the face of it, it is looking rosy, it is largely being driven by the government. And the other part of this is that if the private sector is not spending, then why is it not spending? And a lot of people are saying you should read the first 2 points together. Private sector is not investing, perhaps because it knows that the consumption demand is weak. A private business will invest more when there is a genuine business case in terms of a huge demand coming through. They do not need so much of incentives. They would actually invest if they found that people are spending enough. So I think both the things are related somewhere, and it will take its own time. As the demand from people rises, I think private sector interest would also rise, because you cannot imagine private sector just continuing to invest or playing ball with the government just to be on the good side of the government or anything like that if there was not a genuine business case for it. So that's the other aspect that global investors are worried about, because many of them would be investing in the private sector actually. They're not actually directly lending to the government. And they want to know, if I'm investing, is this business going to have a solid case to continue to be in the business? Would it sell more, make more profits?
Okay, so we've talked about the average spending. We have talked about private companies needing to invest more. But the other factor you write about is the RBI cutting interest rates. And this is just to remind listeners that when RBI cuts rates, banks can borrow more money, and therefore people can borrow more money and spend more money. Could you tell us what we can expect from the RBI going forward?
So now interest rates are very central to the functioning of the economy. If the interest rates continue to be high, then it holds back economic activity. Interest rates, if they come down, it's easier for businesses to borrow and start investment activity. It's easier for people to borrow and buy a car, buy a house. So both from the consumption and the production side, interest rates are very central. And it's that particular thing that, till say about 6 or 8 months back, many people thought that in the first quarter of 2024, which would be something like March or April, RBI might be cutting interest rates. But now that deadline has been shifted to August. And if inflation rates continue to be, persistent and sort of around 6% mark, then who knows, maybe it'll be shifted down further. So that's another thing that is holding back global investors. Because again, when you're investing money, you want businesses to do well. And if those businesses are not going to be doing well because interest rates are high, then I think a lot of global investors might just keep holding back, pulling in the money.
And considering the state of things right now, are investors optimistic that these issues will be resolved going forward?
Yeah, I think mostly Indian economy is a story of tremendous optimism and hope right now in the global scenario. If you look around the world, there'll be just a handful of economies which are actually growing as fast or near about as India does. But also the fact that India is a really massive economy. It's the 5th largest economy, huge in numbers. So India's growing at 6 or 7% is not exactly like a smaller country growing at 6 or 7%. So India's growth is a massive reason for hope and optimism for global investors. And I think it's just a matter of time as these issues get resolved and some of these things improve. I'm sure it's certain that a lot of money will come to India. People would want to be part of this growth journey that India seems set on.
And next, we talk about a sexual harassment case reported at IIM Calcutta. The Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta, after receiving a sexual harassment complaint, has removed its director-in-charge, Sahadeb Sarkar, from his position. The institute issued a statement on Tuesday saying that it has taken action against Sarkar as recommended by its Internal Complaints Committee. And while the charges are under investigation, the IIM management has appointed Professor Shoaib Chattopadhyay as the director-in-charge with immediate effect. To know more about the case, we speak to Indian Express's Santanu Chowdhury, who has been reporting on the matter for the paper. So Shantanu, can you begin by telling us what has exactly happened at IIM Calcutta?
Yes, in a press statement, the IIM Calcutta late on Tuesday evening announced that the director in charge of the institute, which means the interim director, Sahadeb Sarkar, was removed from the post following a complaint of sexual harassment. And according to the press release, it said that the complaint was lodged at the Internal Complaints Committee of the Institute, which expressed its concern and apprehension, and therefore it decided that there is a need to conduct an inquiry into it. So therefore they decided to take an action against the acting director, and therefore he was removed from the post. Following the removal of the director in charge of the institute, Sahadeb Sarkar, the institute in the same press statement announced the appointment of Shoaib Chattopadhyay, who is also a senior faculty member, to the post of the acting director. So at the same time, the institute also announced his replacement.
And what stance has the institution taken regarding the whole incident?
Yes, the institute has so far just issued this press statement. Apart from that, we tried to reach out to the members of the board of the governors and also the dean, but we got no official word from the institute regarding what had actually happened, which required them to take such an action against the acting director. And according to the press statement that was issued by the institute, it's like the IIM-C board of governors held a special meeting on January 6th and accepted the recommendations of the ICC that Professor Sahadeb Sarkar shall not continue in the office of director in charge and shall be removed from the said post and any other position wherein he has administrative charges in IIM Calcutta, because that has been taken during the pendency of the formal inquiry before the ICC. So therefore, the decision was taken and the decision was announced a day before yesterday.
And do we know the exact nature of the complaint?
So far, there has been no official word regarding the nature of the complaint. However, sources said that, it was a female administrative staff who had lodged a complaint of sexual harassment against Sarkar in the month of November. And incidentally, on 7th of November, this Sahadeb Sarkar, who has been a professor at the institute for a very long time, had been made the acting director in the same month, and the complaint was lodged in the month of November last year. We also got to know that maybe the director allegedly heard some lewd comments against the concerned person, which forced the women to lodge a complaint with the internal complaints committee. And we tried to reach out to the acting director for his comments. However, he said that these are the baseless allegations. In a short statement, he said that, I emphatically deny the allegations made against him, and I'm shocked by the baseless allegations. In any case, this seems to be an official press release by the management, and he is prevented from speaking to the press by POSH rules. Therefore, he did not elaborate on anything other than the short press statement that he issued yesterday.
Right. And Shantanu, when a complaint like this is reported to an institution, what is the procedure that is supposed to be followed? Like, how do things proceed?
Well, usually whenever a complaint is lodged at the internal complaints committee of the institute, they are bound to take some measures based on the complaint that has been lodged. So therefore, the institute is bound to do some inquiry, and an investigative committee is also formed in most of the cases. And then they probe the kind of allegations that had been made against any kind of professor, be it an associate professor or be it anyone who's holding a higher post. However, in this case, what we have seen that the complaint was lodged in the month of November, and the action has been taken in the first week of January. So there is clearly a gap of a month in taking an action against the Sarkar. Maybe the institute had taken certain measures before taking such a decision, but we know nothing about it because there has been no details from the institute regarding what had actually happened at the institute. So therefore, we cannot comment on that. And therefore, what we are seeing that, the press statement also indicates that the inquiry is pending at the moment. So therefore, the action has been delayed. We can say that if the complaint was lodged in the month of November and the action is being taken now. So therefore, we can say that, they are actually, started the inquiry right now. And as a measure which has been recommended by the ICC, they have removed the acting director from their post.
Also, a couple of months back, we heard the news of some people entering the IIT BHU campus and harassing a woman. And now we are learning about this case. So what concerns does it raise about the safety of women in educational institutions?
Well, there's definitely a concern because, when you talk about the institutes like IIM and IIT, these are the most premier institutes of the country, and people actually have high respect for the office and the people who work there. So therefore, any kind of a move like this is not going to look very good to the people of the country. So therefore, strong measures must be taken whenever such complaints are raised. And this has happened at IIT BHU, as you have mentioned, and this has happened in IIM Calcutta. So therefore, we can say that, these institutes, lead an example of excellence and in higher education and everything. So therefore, steps must be taken to, ensure that such incidents do not take place at the workplace, because they are talking about so many rules and regulations and so many guidelines. There are like, sexual harassment of women at workplace, which is Prevention, Prohibition, Redressal Act 2013, which is POSH Act, POSH Act. So therefore, there are so many acts that they need to adhere to. So therefore, they have taken an action against the acting director. Now the inquiry is pending. So therefore, we don't know what will be the final outcome. But definitely, if such incidents increase in the country, then there is a concern for the security of women at the workplace. And this is also coming from a female administrative staff. So this also talks about the kind of work atmosphere that is prevailing at such institutes of high importance in the country. So therefore, things like these should not take place in such institutes.
And in the end, we talk about Pakistan's precision strikes over Iran. On Thursday, Pakistan's army announced that it had conducted precision strikes in Iran using killer drones, rockets, loitering munitions, and standoff weapons against the Balochistan Liberation Army and the Balochistan Liberation Front, both labeled as terrorist groups. Notably, these strikes occurred 2 days after Iran's missile and drone attacks in Pakistan's Balochistan province. The army stated that maximum care was taken to avoid collateral damage. However, quoting Iranian media, Reuters said that 9 people were killed in the assault. Pakistan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement in which they said, "This morning, Pakistan undertook a series of highly coordinated and specifically targeted precision military strikes against terrorist hideouts in Sistan-o-Balochistan province of Iran. The operation was codenamed Margbar Sarmchar. The statement also mentioned that in exchanges between Pakistan and Iran over the last couple of years, Pakistan had consistently raised concerns about safe havens enjoyed by Pakistani Eurasian terrorists, self-identifying as Sarmchars in the ungoverned spaces inside Iran. The lack of action on Iran's part had allegedly led these Sarmchars attacking innocent Pakistanis, prompting Pakistan to take matters into its own hand and launching the strikes. While Iran has asked for an explanation from Pakistan's charge d'affaires regarding several explosions in different areas around the city of Saravan in Sistan and Balochistan province, Pakistan's Foreign Office spokesperson Mumtaz Zehra Baloch stated that Iran's attacks had deteriorated the relations between the two nations and hence the country reserves the right to retaliate against the attack.
Pakistan reserves the right to respond to this illegal act, and the responsibility for the consequences will lie squarely with Iran. We have conveyed this message to the government of Iran. We have also informed them.
The Iranian strikes on Tuesday night reportedly targeted two bases of the Balochi militant group Jaish al-Adl in Pakistan's border town of Panjgur in Balochistan province. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Shashank, Bhargava and me, NIharika, Nanda. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.